At 2:17 in the morning, a fire broke out inside the walls of the United States Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. 2 drones had just struck the compound. The diplomatic quarter of the Saudi capital was blanketed in thick black smoke that rose high enough to be seen from miles away. American staff had already been evacuated hours earlier. The building was largely empty, and yet the attack still managed to send a message so loud, so precise, and so strategically calculated that intelligence agencies across a dozen countries spent the next 48 hours in emergency session trying to understand exactly what it meant. Because this was not an accident. This was not a stray drone going off course. This was a deliberate, targeted, intelligence-driven military strike on one of the most sensitive diplomatic compounds in the entire Middle East. And the question that every general, every analyst, every foreign minister in the world was asking in the hours that followed was not simply whether Iran had done it. The question, the genuinely terrifying, world-altering question, was this. If Iran knew exactly where to hit inside that compound, what else do they know? And what are they planning to do next? Because what we are watching right now is not just a military conflict between 3 nations. What we are watching, in real time, is the beginning of a fundamental tectonic shift in the global order. A shift whose consequences will reach far beyond the borders of the Middle East and touch every aspect of your daily life. Your fuel prices, your grocery bills, your stock portfolio, the supply chain that delivers your car parts, your electronics, your medications. The global economy as a functioning interconnected system is now facing a stress test unlike anything it has encountered in decades. And whether that system holds, or whether it fractures in ways that take years to repair, will depend on decisions being made right now, in the next 72 hours, by a handful of leaders in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and whatever remains of Tehran's command structure. Stay with me through every minute of this video, because by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly what happened in Riyadh that night, who authorized it, what the intelligence behind it reveals about Iran's capabilities, why the global economy is now teetering on the edge of a serious energy crisis, and why one specific decision, one that has not yet been publicly announced, will either contain this conflict or transform it into something that the world has not experienced since the Second World War. Let us go back to the very beginning of this story, because to understand Riyadh, you first have to understand the opening act. You have to understand the scale and the audacity of what the United States and Israel did on the night of February 28, 2026, and why it set off a chain reaction that is still accelerating as you watch this video. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time on February 28, 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump appeared on camera in an 8-minute video statement that he released to the American public while the operation was already underway. Behind him, outside the windows of the White House, Washington, D.C., was asleep. But in the skies above Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah, ancient cities home to millions of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, American and Israeli warplanes were already in motion. The bombs were already falling. The operation was already, in the cold and clinical language of military planners, kinetic. Trump's message was short, blunt, and genuinely historic in a way that few presidential addresses have been. He said in direct and unambiguous terms that the purpose of the U.S. strikes on Iran was regime change. He cited Iran's decades-long involvement in funding and arming proxy militias across the Middle East. He cited Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. He cited what he called the menacing activities that had, in his assessment, endangered the United States, its allies, and the stability of the entire region. He warned the members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the most powerful military organization in the Islamic Republic, to lay down their weapons and accept complete immunity. Or, in his exact words, face certain death. There was no diplomatic ambiguity in that statement. There was no carefully worded hedging. It was a declaration of war framed as an ultimatum. This joint operation carried 2 names. On the Israeli side, it was called Operation Roaring Lion. On the American side, Operation Epic Fury. And it had been months in the making. This was not a reaction to a single provocation. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of a crisis. The intelligence preparation, the target selection, the coordination between U.S. Central Command and the Israeli Defense Forces, the positioning of naval assets, all of it had been underway for weeks. The USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford, 2 of the most powerful aircraft carriers on Earth, had been repositioned to the region along with multiple guided missile destroyers. NATO airborne warning and control system aircraft, the sophisticated surveillance planes known as AWACS, had been operating out of Konya Airport in Turkey, circling Iranian airspace and feeding targeting data to Allied commanders. Turkey later denied any knowledge or involvement in the operation, but the intelligence trail was clear. The Gang of 8, America's 8 most senior congressional intelligence leaders, had been briefed in classified sessions before the first munition ever left the ground. This operation had been planned, approved, prepared, and initiated with the full weight of American military and intelligence infrastructure behind it. And then, in the early hours of February 28th, the strikes began. The targets selected were Iranian leadership, senior military commanders, nuclear enrichment facilities, ballistic missile launch sites, and the physical infrastructure of the IRGC's command and control network. The stated goal was not merely to degrade Iran's military capacity in the way previous Israeli operations had attempted. The stated goal was to fundamentally decapitate the system of government that had ruled Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, to destroy not just the weapons, but the leadership, the institutions, and the chain of command that made Iran a strategic threat. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 30 years, the final authority on every major decision from nuclear negotiations to the deployment of proxy forces across 4 countries, was killed. His compound in Tehran was destroyed. Ali Shamkhani, the former head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council and one of the most powerful figures in the Islamic Republic's security establishment, was also killed. Dozens of other senior officials, commanders, and government ministers were eliminated in the opening hours of the operation. The U.S. Air Force deployed B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most technologically advanced strategic aircraft in the world, to strike Iran's ballistic missile facilities in hardened underground bunkers. These were targets that only stealth platforms with deep penetration munitions could reliably reach. The deployment of B-2s told you everything about how serious and how long-planned this operation was. Israel dropped more than 1,200 munitions across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces within a single day. The scale was staggering. The scale of this operation was unlike anything the world had seen since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And just like in 2003, the world woke up on the morning of February 28th to a reality that had fundamentally changed overnight. The realization that a war, a real and declared and openly acknowledged war, had just begun between the world's most powerful military alliance and one of the most strategically important countries in the Middle East. But here is the critical thing that most news coverage missed in the first 24 hours. While the airstrikes were devastating in their execution and breathtaking in their scope, the military operation itself was only half the story, and arguably not even the most important half. Because what Iran did in response, what Iran had clearly pre-planned as its retaliation strategy, was not just a military counterstrike. It was a carefully constructed economic and strategic attack designed to inflict the maximum possible pain on the United States, on its Gulf allies, and on the global economy, all simultaneously. And to understand why Iran's response was shaped the way it was, you need to understand something that almost no mainstream analysis has properly examined. You need to understand the internal situation inside Iran in the weeks and months before the strikes began. Because that context changes everything. There is a dangerous assumption that many analysts make when they encounter a weakened adversary. The assumption is that a weakened enemy is, by definition, a less dangerous enemy. When it comes to Iran in early 2026, that assumption could not be more strategically wrong. And the leaders who made that assumption may ultimately pay a very high price for it. By the time the United States and Israel launched their joint operation on February 28th, Iran was already in a state of serious internal crisis. Mass protests had swept through the country throughout January 2026, driven by a combustible combination of factors that had been building for years. The Iranian economy was in near collapse. Decades of international sanctions, chronic government mismanagement, and the diversion of enormous resources toward military and proxy spending had left the average Iranian citizen facing inflation rates that made daily life genuinely difficult. Infrastructure across the country was deteriorating. Power outages were frequent. Clean water access in some provinces was unreliable. The social contract between the Islamic Republic and its population, which had always been fragile, had reached a point of critical failure. People were not just unhappy, they were furious, and they were in the streets. The government responded to these protests with the overwhelming and indiscriminate use of force, which is the only tool a government with no remaining legitimacy has left. But the force, while effective at dispersing individual demonstrations, did nothing to address the underlying conditions that had produced the anger. Student protests had resumed as recently as late February, just days before the American and Israeli strikes began. Iran, on the morning of February 28th, was a country already under enormous internal strain. Iran's regional alliances, the so-called axis of resistance that Tehran had spent 4 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars constructing, had been systematically weakened over the previous 2 years. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful and capable proxy force in Lebanon, had been subjected to 18 months of sustained, intensive Israeli military action that had degraded its leadership, its weapon stockpiles, its tunnel infrastructure, and its operational capacity to a degree that would have seemed unimaginable just 3 years earlier. Hamas in Gaza had been militarily devastated. Syria, which had long served as the critical land corridor through which Iran moved weapons, money, and personnel westward to Hezbollah and other allied groups, had undergone a dramatic political transformation when President Assad was removed from power by rebel forces, effectively severing that corridor. Iran's carefully constructed regional network, the strategic investment of an entire generation of planning and resources, was in a state of advanced disrepair. And then, in June of 2025, a previous 12-day war between Israel and Iran, smaller in scale than what was now unfolding but significant in its consequences, had already badly damaged Iran's integrated air defense systems and made additional inroads against its nuclear infrastructure. The Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, Iran's most important strategic asset in its long-running effort to develop a nuclear deterrent, had been significantly degraded. By virtually every external assessment, Iran in February 2026 was at the most strategically vulnerable point it had occupied since the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So here is the strategic paradox, and it is one that experienced strategists understand, but that political leaders often ignore at their peril. A weakened Iran, an Iran that has had its supreme leader assassinated, its military degraded, its nuclear program targeted, its regional proxy network dismantled, and its government destabilized by internal protests and external military pressure, that Iran has almost nothing left to lose, and a state with nothing left to lose is not a defeated state. A state with nothing to lose is the most unpredictable, the most dangerous, the most willing to accept catastrophic risk that exists in the international system. Because when you strip away a government's ability to preserve itself through conventional means, what you are left with is a government that will pursue any available asymmetric option to inflict punishment on its adversaries, regardless of the long-term consequences for itself or for the region. Iran's response was not the response of a defeated nation. It was not the response of a country that had accepted its fate and was going through the motions of symbolic resistance. It was the response of a country that had spent years pre-planning exactly this contingency, the contingency in which American and Israeli forces launched a massive coordinated assault, and that had positioned its assets, pre-targeted its objectives, and prepared its operational doctrine specifically for this moment. What came next was not improvisation. What came next was the execution of a plan. Iran named its counter-operation with characteristic drama Operation True Promise 4. The name was an incremental continuation of a series of escalating military operations going back years, each one larger and more consequential than the last. And the geographic scope of what Iran unleashed in retaliation was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. Missiles and drones were fired simultaneously at targets across 9 countries: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, all at once, not sequentially. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced publicly that it had launched coordinated attacks on 27 separate military bases across the Middle East where U.S. troops are deployed, in addition to striking Israeli military facilities in Tel Aviv and other locations. The IRGC was also targeting U.S. naval assets and diplomatic facilities. The scale of the operation, when you look at it on a map, simultaneous strikes across 9 sovereign nations against dozens of military installations, targeting American forces, allied forces, civilian infrastructure, and diplomatic compounds, reveals something that should be deeply unsettling. This was not a country caught off guard and striking back blindly. This was a country executing a pre-prepared war plan with remarkable coordination, given that its supreme leader had just been killed and its command structure had just been subjected to the most intensive decapitation strike in modern military history. Think about that for a moment. Iran lost its supreme leader and most senior security officials, absorbed 1,200 Israeli munitions and B-2 strikes in a single day, and within hours it was simultaneously firing at 9 countries. The operational resilience that implies, the pre-delegation of authority, the pre-positioned assets, the pre-approved targeting packages, Iran had prepared for this, Iran had war-gamed this, and Iran was executing. In Bahrain, the tiny island nation that sits in the middle of the Persian Gulf and hosts the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, the forward command of American naval power in the Middle East, drone attacks struck near military installations. The strikes triggered emergency protocols at the base and forced the temporary suspension of certain operational activities. In Kuwait, a devastating drone strike hit a port facility with catastrophic consequences for the Americans stationed there. 4 U.S. soldiers were killed. All of them were members of the 103rd Sustainment Command, an Army Reserve unit based in Des Moines, Iowa. The IRGC's choice of target was not random. The 103rd Sustainment Command is a logistics unit, not frontline infantry, but the people who manage the supply lines, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and equipment flow continuously to forward positions. By targeting them, Iran was sending a deliberate message. We are not just targeting your combat forces, we are targeting the infrastructure that makes your combat forces possible. We are reaching for the operational nervous system of the American military presence in this region. In the United Arab Emirates, drone debris from intercepted missiles fell on residential areas near Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi. A Pakistani national was killed. An Asian national was killed in a residential district of the capital by falling shrapnel. 4 airport staff at Dubai International Airport sustained injuries. 4 people were injured at Palm Jumeirah after falling debris caused a fire in a building. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs on Earth, found itself in the crossfire of a war that its own government had spent months trying to prevent. In Jordan, the armed forces intercepted and destroyed 49 separate drones and ballistic missiles that had entered Jordanian airspace. Jordan is not a belligerent in this conflict. It has a peace treaty with Israel and has spent decades building a reputation as one of the most diplomatically stable states in the region. The volume and scatter of Iran's retaliatory barrage was so enormous that it was physically impossible to confine its weapons to intended targets. 49 projectiles crossing into Jordan was not deliberate targeting. It was the inevitable consequence of launching hundreds of weapons simultaneously across a geographically constrained region. In Qatar, home to Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the entire Middle East, the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command, and the base from which American air operations across the region are coordinated, Iranian missiles targeted the international airport. Qatar's air defense systems intercepted them. But the targeting itself, the fact that Iran had the audacity, the reach, the operational intelligence, the prepositioned capability to attempt a strike on the hub of American military command authority in the Middle East, revealed something critically important about what Iran was still capable of, even in its degraded state. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere in this region that hosts American military power is beyond our reach. And then came the decision that sent the most violent shockwaves of all, not through military command centers, but through energy trading floors, central bank boardrooms, and the finance ministries of every major economy on the planet. Iran announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. To understand the full magnitude of that decision, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents in the architecture of the global economy. Not geographically. Anyone can look at a map. What you need to understand is the economic reality that this narrow strip of water embodies every single day, without pause, without interruption, year after year. The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway that, at its narrowest point, is just 21 miles wide. It separates the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman. And through those 21 miles, through that single irreplaceable passage, flows approximately 20% of all the oil consumed by every country on this planet, every single day of the year. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, not 20% of OPEC production, 20% of total global oil consumption. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, every one of the major Gulf oil exporters has one route and only one route to get their product to world markets. And that route goes through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran's Brigadier General Ebrahim Jabari appeared on Iranian state television and declared the strait closed, when he said that any vessel attempting to transit would be set on fire by the heroes of the IRGC Navy, he was not issuing a military ultimatum. He was issuing an economic declaration of war on the entire industrialized world. He was threatening, in a single sentence broadcast from Iranian state media, to cut off the energy supply of Europe, of Japan, of South Korea, of India, of China, of every economy in Southeast Asia, and of large portions of the developing world. He was threatening to take 20% of the world's oil supply and simply remove it from the market. Not through negotiation, not through OPEC decisions, through force of arms, in a 21-mile channel using the IRGC naval assets that Iran had been specifically building, training, and equipping for exactly this contingency for the past 3 decades. The immediate market response was swift, severe, and entirely predictable to anyone who had been paying attention. Crude oil futures spiked dramatically in overnight trading. Energy markets went into a state of near panic. 150 freight ships, a significant portion of them oil tankers representing hundreds of millions of barrels of cargo, found themselves stalled and unable to move, anchored in the Gulf of Oman waiting for clarity that was not coming. 2 tankers were directly targeted and struck off the coast of Oman, sending the clearest possible signal that Iran's threat to set ships on fire was not rhetorical. International maritime insurance rates for any vessel operating in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, or the Arabian Sea entered a period of vertical ascent, increasing so rapidly into such extreme levels that many smaller and mid-sized shipping operators concluded that the economics of Gulf operations had become simply untenable. They pulled their ships out of the region entirely. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States jumped 11 cents in a single overnight session. Not over a week, not over a month of gradually rising crude prices. 11 cents overnight. Wall Street opened the following morning to a significant broad-based sell-off. Every sector that depends on stable, affordable energy, which is to say almost every sector of the economy, was under pressure. Airlines, which had already been struggling with thin margins in the post-pandemic recovery period, faced a devastating combination of spiking jet fuel costs and the closure of major air corridors through Iranian and Gulf airspace. Shipping and logistics companies faced the same combination of higher fuel costs and restricted routing options. Manufacturing companies began to assess their exposure to supply chain disruptions. Consumer goods companies began quietly modeling scenarios in which raw material costs, transportation costs, and energy costs all rose simultaneously for an extended period. The United States responded by announcing that the U.S. Navy would begin escorting oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, and that Washington would offer insurance coverage for Gulf shipping to keep tankers moving. On the surface, this sounds reassuring. In practice, it represents an enormous operational commitment with significant risks that the public has not been fully informed about. The Strait of Hormuz is not open ocean. It is a narrow, shallow, geographically constrained waterway, and it is almost perfectly designed by its physical characteristics to favor exactly the kind of asymmetric, fast attack, small boat, mine-laying naval warfare that the IRGC has been developing, practicing, and refining for 30 years. American aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers are extraordinarily powerful in open ocean engagements. In the Strait of Hormuz, escorting slow-moving oil tankers through a channel lined with Iranian shore-based anti-ship missiles, IRGC fast boats, and potentially pre-positioned naval mines, those same warships face a very different set of challenges. Iran has studied this problem for decades. They have invested specifically and deliberately in the capabilities designed to exploit it. And the broader economic implications of even a partial, sustained disruption to Strait of Hormuz traffic extend far beyond the immediate oil price shock. Japan imports over 90% of its total energy from the Middle East and would enter a genuine energy crisis within weeks if Persian Gulf oil stopped flowing. South Korea, India, China, and the entirety of Southeast Asia are in comparable positions of critical dependence. A prolonged blockade would not just raise fuel prices globally. It would trigger energy rationing across Asia, crash manufacturing output, and cascade into supply chain disruptions of a kind and scale that would make the COVID-19 pandemic supply chain crisis look, in retrospect, like a minor inconvenience. Now we come to the moment that is the heart of this entire story, the event that inspired this video. The incident that, on the surface of the news coverage, appeared to be a straightforward drone strike on a diplomatic building, but which, when examined carefully and in full context, reveals something far more sophisticated, far more alarming, and far more consequential than almost any outlet has yet properly reported. Let us go back to the early morning of March 3rd, 2026. 2 drones struck the U.S. Embassy compound in the diplomatic quarter of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry confirmed the attack within hours, describing it as resulting in a limited fire and minor material damage to the building. No American personnel were killed. The compound had already been significantly drawn down after earlier shelter-in-place alerts had been issued. On the surface, reading that summary in a news ticker, this looked like a fairly standard escalatory episode in a rapidly escalating conflict. Iran hitting an American diplomatic target. Damaging, but not catastrophic. One of many similar incidents happening simultaneously across the region. But then the Washington Post published a report that fundamentally reframed the entire incident. According to reporting based on sources familiar with the intelligence assessment, the 2 drones that struck the embassy in Riyadh had not simply hit the diplomatic building at random. They had struck with what the reporting described as deliberate and precise targeting, the CIA's station within the embassy compound. The Central Intelligence Agency maintains stations at many U.S. diplomatic missions around the world, and the Riyadh station is one of the most important in the entire Middle East. A critical hub for intelligence collection, source management, liaison operations with Saudi intelligence services, and analytical support for U.S. operations across the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a symbolic strike on a diplomatic building. This was a targeted, intelligence-informed precision strike against one of America's most sensitive overseas intelligence operations. Think carefully about what that operational achievement requires. To target a CIA station inside a foreign embassy compound, you need to know not just where the embassy is, but which building within that compound houses the intelligence operation, as distinct from consular affairs offices, the ambassador's residence, or administrative sections. That level of granular, facility-specific targeting intelligence does not come from satellite imagery alone. It requires human intelligence, sources with direct or indirect access to the internal organization of the compound. And the fact that Iran either possessed that information or had access to it through a third party should be deeply unsettling to every American intelligence professional currently operating anywhere in the Middle East. NBC News reported in the hours following the attack that the embassy had sustained damage that knocked out communication services, that the Riyadh CIA station's ability to communicate with Langley and with other regional partners had been disrupted. The U.S. mission to Saudi Arabia had issued shelter-in-place notices covering not just Riyadh, but also Jeddah and Dhahran, the eastern province city that sits at the heart of Saudi Arabia's most critical oil infrastructure and hosts significant numbers of American energy sector workers and military contractors. The notices told American citizens to avoid the embassy entirely until further notice. In the hours that followed, an Iranian drone struck a parking lot at the U.S. consulate in Dubai, causing a small fire. The U.S. embassy in Kuwait City was attacked and subsequently closed. The State Department ordered the departure of non-emergency personnel from Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Qatar, Jordan, and the UAE, 6 countries simultaneously. The Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs issued a statement telling all American citizens across 12 Middle Eastern countries to depart immediately due to serious safety risks. 12 countries. That is not a precautionary measure. That is the State Department acknowledging that the entire American diplomatic and civilian presence across the Middle East is now operating in an environment of active, widespread threat. Consider what Iran was attempting to accomplish with this coordinated campaign against U.S. embassies, consulates, and diplomatic facilities. Taken individually, each of these incidents looks like an aggressive but manageable retaliatory strike. Taken together, as a coordinated strategic campaign, the intent becomes clear. Iran was attempting to make every American diplomatic and intelligence presence in the Middle East simultaneously untenable, physically unsafe, operationally compromised, or both. Because an American diplomatic network that is either evacuated or operating in lockdown mode is an American diplomatic network that cannot gather intelligence effectively, cannot coordinate with allied governments effectively, and cannot manage the political dimensions of a complex regional conflict. Iran was not just shooting at buildings. Iran was attempting to blind the United States and the region at the very moment when clear vision mattered most. Saudi Arabia's response to the embassy attack was pointed and diplomatically complex in ways that reveal the extraordinary pressure that Riyadh is under. The Saudi Foreign Ministry condemned what it called a cowardly and unjustified attack in violation of international law protecting diplomatic premises and personnel in armed conflict. Saudi Arabia reserved the right to take measures to protect its security, including responding to aggression. These are strong words, but in the same statement, Saudi Arabia once again reaffirmed that it would not allow its airspace or territory to be used to target Iran. Saudi Arabia was walking a line so fine it was nearly invisible. Its capital had been attacked. Its oil infrastructure in the eastern province was under threat. Satellite images showed smoke rising from the Ras Tanura oil refinery, one of the largest petroleum processing facilities in the world. Saudi Arabia's air defense systems were intercepting cruise missiles and drones in significant numbers. And yet, Saudi Arabia was simultaneously signaling to Iran that it was not an active participant in the U.S.-Israeli military campaign and did not wish to be treated as one. Whether that signaling was effective, whether Iran would continue to distinguish between Saudi Arabia as an involuntary host of American forces and Saudi Arabia as an active belligerent, was one of the most important and unresolved questions of the entire conflict. While the world was absorbing the news about Riyadh and processing the implications of the Strait of Hormuz closure, a dimension of this conflict was unfolding that received almost no serious analytical coverage, and that is the attack on the digital and data infrastructure of the Gulf. Because Iran's retaliation was not confined to physical military targets. It was also directed at the economic and technological foundations that the Gulf states have been building for the past decade, as they attempt to diversify their economies away from oil dependence. Amazon Web Services, AWS, is the world's largest cloud computing platform and the digital backbone of thousands of businesses, government agencies, financial institutions, and logistics operators across the Middle East and globally. AWS maintains major data center infrastructure in the Gulf region. On March 1st and 2nd, as Iranian drones and missiles rained down across the Gulf states, a site in Bahrain housing AWS infrastructure was damaged in a drone strike. AWS was forced to issue an extraordinary advisory to its enterprise customers, informing them that structural damage had occurred, that power delivery had been disrupted, and that fire suppression activities had resulted in additional water damage to equipment. The company told customers to consider migrating their workloads to other cloud regions and said it expected a prolonged recovery period given the nature of the physical damage involved. The economic implications are far larger than most coverage has appreciated. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program depends critically on a stable, reliable digital infrastructure environment that global corporations require before locating regional operations. The UAE's ambition to position Dubai as the Middle East's leading technology hub depends on the same foundations. An AWS advisory telling enterprise customers their Gulf region data is at risk, and they should consider moving it elsewhere. Signals to every global technology company weighing a Gulf investment that the region's reliability cannot be taken for granted. Aviation had been similarly devastated. Major airspace closures across Iran, Iraq, and parts of the Gulf had forced hundreds of international flight routes to be canceled or rerouted on dramatically longer paths. Airlines that normally flew eastward through Iranian airspace toward Asia were adding 3 to 5 hours to journey times by rerouting south around the Arabian Peninsula. Every additional hour of flight is additional fuel consumed at precisely the moment fuel prices were spiking because of the Strait closure. Several carriers suspended Gulf routes entirely pending a clearer picture of the threat environment. The global shipping industry was simultaneously confronting its own cascading crisis. 150 freight vessels stalled at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, waiting. Marine insurance underwriters in London pulling back their coverage or repricing it to levels that made commercial operations economically unviable. Container shipping rates spiking as capacity left the market. Companies dependent on just-in-time manufacturing, the precision supply chain model that has defined global manufacturing for 30 years, faced the prospect of inventory shortfalls that could halt production lines. Automotive manufacturers, electronics producers, pharmaceutical companies, consumer goods brands, every sector relying on components or finished goods moving through international shipping was running emergency contingency exercises that most had never needed to conduct before. Now, here is the political dimension of this crisis that deserves far more attention than it has received in mainstream coverage. Because the military and economic dimensions of this conflict, as dramatic as they are, may ultimately be less consequential than the political fractures that are opening up. Fractures between the United States and the very Gulf allies, whose cooperation is essential to the American military's ability to operate in the region at all. Every one of the major Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, had, in the weeks and months before the February 28th strikes, privately and in some cases explicitly communicated to Washington that they opposed a military attack on Iran at this time. They had counseled patience. They had argued that sanctions pressure and diplomatic negotiations represented a more sustainable path to constraining Iran's nuclear program. They had warned, based on their own intelligence assessments and their own geographic proximity to Iran, that a military strike would trigger exactly the kind of retaliatory campaign that was now unfolding. A campaign that would inevitably hit their territory, their infrastructure, their economies, and their people, regardless of their own official stance toward the conflict. And they had been overruled. Washington and Tel Aviv had made their strategic calculation. They had concluded that the window for decisive military action was narrowing, that Iran's new underground nuclear facilities would within months become effectively immune to conventional military strikes. And they had acted. And now the Gulf states were paying the price, in drone attacks on their capital cities, in damage to their oil infrastructure, in the closure of their airspace, in the departure of foreign workers and business travelers who were the lifeblood of their service economies, and in the potential long-term damage to their reputations as stable, safe, business-friendly environments, reputations that had taken decades of careful work to build and that could be damaged very quickly by a conflict of this kind. The analytical question that follows is whether the Gulf states' growing frustration would eventually translate into political pressure significant enough to change Washington's calculations. Former Israeli government advisor Daniel Levy articulated the dilemma clearly. How long the U.S. allies in the Gulf were ready to withstand Iranian assaults on their territory in response to a war they had repeatedly cautioned against was genuinely unclear. The Gulf monarchies face their own populations, their own economic interests, and their own long-term relationships with Iran, a country they share a body of water with and will continue to share a neighborhood with long after any American military campaign concludes. Their tolerance for absorbing Iranian punishment on behalf of a Washington decision they disagreed with was not unlimited. Canada's Prime Minister, speaking from Sydney during a visit to Australia, captured the broader international mood precisely when he said his government supported U.S. and Israeli strikes, but with regret. He called the conflict another example of the failure of the international order. It was a statement that reflected the quiet unease of dozens of governments around the world, governments that could not openly oppose the United States, but that were deeply troubled by the escalatory trajectory of a conflict whose endpoint remained entirely unclear. The United Nations, meanwhile, was issuing warnings on multiple fronts simultaneously. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, was warning of increasing risk to nuclear safety in the region following the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, including the damage reported at Natanz. The IAEA Director General told NBC News that while his agency had not seen evidence of a systematic and structured program to manufacture nuclear weapons in Iran, Iran had enriched uranium to 60% purity, a level he noted that only countries with nuclear weapons had historically pursued. The centrifuges, he said, had been spinning constantly, producing more and more of that material. And theoretically, he assessed, Iran had accumulated sufficient enriched material to produce more than 10 nuclear warheads, if it chose to weaponize it. UNESCO condemned the damage to the historic Golistan Palace in Tehran, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a structure of profound cultural significance dating back to the 16th century, as a grave violation of humanitarian law. The UN Secretary-General was calling for immediate restraint and a return to diplomacy, while privately acknowledging that the window for either was vanishingly narrow. France, in a move that startled European observers, announced that President Macron had decided to increase France's nuclear arsenal and to authorize the temporary deployment of nuclear-armed aircraft to European allies. France framed this as a response to broader European security concerns rather than a direct reaction to events in the Middle East. But the timing was unmistakable. When a major nuclear power decides that this particular moment in history calls for expanding its nuclear posture and forward deploying nuclear weapons to allied countries, it is telling you something about how that government assesses the overall risk environment, and that assessment was not reassuring. Vice President J.D. Vance attempted to set boundaries around the American commitment when he emphasized publicly that the president's primary objective was to ensure that Iran could never have a nuclear weapon and to fundamentally change the Iranian regime's mindset. He was careful to note that this was not a project for a multi-year conflict, and that the administration did not envision the kind of open-ended, boots-on-the-ground commitment that had characterized America's post-2001 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But he was equally clear that the United States would continue operations until all objectives were met. And the objectives, as Trump had originally framed them in his opening statement, regime change, elimination of Iran's nuclear capacity, and the end of Iran's menacing activities, were objectives whose achievement was, to say the least, not guaranteed by air power alone. And that brings us to the question that underlies everything else, the question that is, in a very real sense, the most important question of this entire conflict. What actually happens inside Iran? Because everything that the United States and Israel have done militarily since February 28th is, at its core, a bet on a particular answer to that question. The bet is that if you kill the supreme leader, destroy the command structure, and make it clear to the Iranian population that continued support for the regime carries existential risks, the Iranian people will rise up, the IRGC will fracture, the government will collapse, and a more moderate, more cooperative, more Western-compatible successor government will emerge. That is the theory of change. And it is a theory whose historical track record in analogous situations should give serious pause to anyone betting their foreign policy on it. Netanyahu's message to the Iranian people in Farsi, his appeal to them to come to the streets in millions and finish the job of overthrowing the regime, was genuinely felt, or at least genuinely stated. Trump's similar appeal to IRGC members to lay down their weapons reflected the same underlying assumption, that the population and even the military were waiting for an external catalyst to act. And there were genuine reports of segments of the Iranian population who welcomed the strikes as representing exactly the intervention they had hoped for. Years of protest, years of repression, years of watching the government spend the country's wealth on foreign military adventures, while domestic living standards declined. There were Iranians who were prepared, at least initially, to regard the American and Israeli operation with something approaching relief. But the situation inside Iran was, as it always is, considerably more complicated than any single narrative could capture. Because simultaneously, the bombing of Iranian cities, the killing of the supreme leader, the destruction of historic sites, the civilian casualties, all of these were generating a countervailing reaction, a nationalistic rallying effect, the same instinct that causes populations everywhere in the world, regardless of their political views about their own government, to close ranks when their country is attacked from outside. It is the same instinct that characterized the early months of every major foreign military intervention in the modern era, and it was providing the hardliners within the IRGC, the faction most committed to continued resistance and most opposed to any negotiated settlement, with a propaganda narrative that was, from their perspective, extremely useful. The foreign aggressor was confirming everything they had always said about American intentions toward Iran. Senator Mark Warner, the vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and one of the 8 members of Congress who had been briefed on the operation in advance, went public with a criticism that carried particular weight, precisely because of his access to classified intelligence. He accused the White House of starting what he called a war of choice, a conflict initiated without a clear objective, without a coherent strategy for the day after, and without an adequate plan for how and when it ends. That is not a talking point from an opposition politician unfamiliar with the classified picture. That is the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee with full access to the same intelligence that informed the decision to strike, telling the American public that in his assessment, the strategic planning behind this operation was inadequate. When Trump was asked to respond, when a reporter asked him specifically what the U.S. response to the embassy attack in Riyadh and the deaths of American service members would look like, his answer was exactly 4 words. You will find out soon. So let us now do what the best analysis must always do. Let us think clearly and systematically about where this goes from here, because there are 4 genuinely distinct scenarios in front of us, And each of them leads to a dramatically different world. In the first scenario, the one that Washington is publicly and privately betting on, the combination of military strikes, the death of Khamenei, and the economic pressure of continued operations causes the Iranian government to fragment rapidly. The IRGC, seeing no viable path to strategic victory, begins to fracture into factions, some wanting to fight, some wanting to negotiate, some simply trying to survive. A provisional civilian authority, perhaps drawn from the enormous Iranian diaspora and the technocratic professional class that exists within the country, manages to establish itself as a credible interlocutor. Negotiations begin quietly, through back channels. The Strait of Hormuz reopens within weeks. Oil prices normalize over a period of months. A diplomatic framework is established for a post-Islamic Republic Iran. The Gulf states welcome the outcome even while resenting the process. This is the best-case scenario. It is also, based on the historical record and on the deep institutional resilience of the IRGC as an organization, the scenario that independent regional experts consider the least probable. In the second scenario, the IRGC does not collapse. It disperses and adapts. The organizational structure that has sustained the Iranian Revolutionary Guard through 30 years of sanctions, multiple wars, and constant external pressure proves resilient enough to survive even the decapitation of the political leadership above it. Iran becomes a theater of sustained, grinding, low-intensity conflict. American and Israeli air power continuing to strike targets, Iranian asymmetric assets continuing to strike back, the Strait remaining partially restricted, oil prices remaining elevated, and the Gulf states absorbing a continuous low-level threat environment that is too persistent to ignore and too diffuse to easily eliminate. This scenario has no obvious endpoint. It could last years. It would permanently reshape the risk calculations of every company and every government considering investment or operations in the Gulf region. It would accelerate energy transition strategies globally as importing nations desperately sought to reduce their dependence on Persian Gulf supply. It is, in some ways, the scenario whose long-term economic consequences might ultimately prove more damaging than even a shorter but more intense conflict. In the third scenario, the one that keeps defense planners and diplomats awake at night, Iranian retaliation reaches a threshold that forces the Gulf states off the careful fence they are trying to walk. A catastrophic strike on the Ras Tanura refinery that takes major Saudi oil processing capacity offline. A mass casualty attack on a U.S. military base in the Gulf that kills dozens or hundreds of American personnel. A successful drone strike that causes a major fire or explosion at a Gulf liquefied natural gas facility. Any of these could trigger a response from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or both that constitutes de facto entry into the conflict. Once the Gulf states are formally in the conflict, the political and military dynamics change completely. China, which has enormous economic stakes in Gulf stability and has been quietly cultivating relationships across the region, comes under intense domestic political pressure to respond. Russia, internationally isolated and looking for leverage, sees an opportunity. The conflict ceases to be a U.S. Israel versus Iran confrontation and becomes something larger, with multiple great powers either directly involved or directly influencing the outcome. This is the scenario that, if it materializes, will be studied in international relations classrooms for the next 50 years as a case study in how regional conflicts can escape containment. In the fourth scenario, the one that almost nobody is talking about, but that history suggests deserves serious weight. The economic damage to the Gulf states becomes so severe and the political pressure on Washington from its regional partners so intense that a diplomatic off-ramp is found before any of the above catastrophes materialize. Qatar or Oman, both of which have historical experience as back-channel diplomatic facilitators between Iran and the West, quietly open communications with whatever Iranian authority is functional enough to negotiate. A ceasefire framework is assembled, imperfect, contested, dissatisfying to hardliners on all sides, but functional. Iran agrees to verifiable limits on its nuclear program. The U.S. and Israel declare that their operational objectives have been achieved. Both sides construct domestic narratives that allow them to claim some form of victory. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. Oil prices begin to ease. The world does not exhale so much as take a slightly less panicked breath. The probability distribution across these four scenarios is genuinely, honestly uncertain. No analyst, no matter how well sourced, no matter how sophisticated their models, no matter how deep their regional expertise, can tell you with confidence which of these paths we are on. What we can say with confidence, based on everything we have examined in this video, is that the outcome will not be determined primarily by military force. Military force has already been applied at massive scale by both sides. What comes next will be determined by economics, by the patience of the Gulf states, by the coherence and the decisions of whatever Iranian authority emerges from the leadership vacuum left by Khamenei's death, by the calculations of China and Russia as they assess their own interests, and by a small number of decisions that will be made in the next 72 hours in Washington, in Riyadh, in Doha, and in whatever command center the IRGC is currently operating from. What started as a coordinated military operation to eliminate a nuclear threat and achieve regime change has become something far larger, far more complex, and far more consequential than the architects of that operation appear to have fully anticipated. The drone that struck the CIA station inside the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh was not just an attack on a building, and it was not just an attack on a diplomatic compound. It was a message delivered with precision. We know where your most sensitive operations are. We know the difference between your public face and your intelligence infrastructure, and we can reach both. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz was not just a military tactic. It was an economic declaration of war directed at the entire industrialized world, a demonstration that Iran, even in its most degraded and wounded state, retains the ability to impose enormous costs on every country on Earth simply by threatening those 21 miles of water. And the 4 American soldiers killed at a logistics port in Kuwait were a reminder, written in the most painful possible terms, that asymmetric warfare does not respect clean boundaries between combatants and support personnel. We are at the beginning of something, not at the end. The story of what really happened in Riyadh, the CIA station, the intelligence implications, the strategic escalation ladder, the economic fallout, the 4 scenarios that now define the range of possible futures, is a story that is still being written. The next 72 hours will begin to tell us whether the leaders involved have the strategic imagination and the political courage to find an off-ramp before the momentum of escalation reaches a point that no one can reverse. If this analysis has given you a clearer picture of a situation that most coverage has made more confusing rather than less, share it with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the world right now. Subscribe to Stay With Us as this story develops. And tell us in the comments, which of the 4 scenarios do you believe is most likely? Because right now, in the rooms where these decisions are being made, nobody knows the answer. And that uncertainty, that genuine, unresolved, high-stakes uncertainty, is precisely what makes this the most consequential story on the planet.